Good evening or good morning, folks. It's just a couple minutes before 2:30 a.m. GMT time on Monday, June 15th. So we're going to take a look at Forex for the week. Before we start, of course, we do have the European Court of Justice ruling coming out on Tuesday on whether the ECB can continue its monetary transactions or not, or more specifically, whether they're constitutional or not. And on Wednesday, we have FOMC. So trading prior to the FOMC release could be fairly difficult. Definitely do not want to hold trades over top of the court ruling. That being said, hopefully we will be able to get entries on any opportunities that present themselves. First, we're going to take a look at pound New Zealand dollar. This is one that I haven't been including for a little while, nor have I really been trading it. But with the basically poor performance of the dairy industry and the rate cuts from the New Zealand dollar, this gives us a pretty good opportunity to trade long. You can see that we had a massive 600 pip move up last week, and we still have quite large ranges on this pair. So I'm going to look for a pullback essentially to the 61.8 fib, and that is going to give us 2.17 is just below that, only a handful of pips. And then we have the 4-hour 55 directly above that. So I'm going to look for basically a pullback into that area and then a rejection to long. With this pair, of course, you can see how large the ranges are, and it does tend to be quite volatile. I think there's a decent amount of small stop hunting that goes on, so plan for your stops to be a little bit larger than normal. All right, let's take a look at pound CAD. This one looks like we're still in our range, which the bottom of the range is moving up slightly as the EMAs progress upwards. But basically, right now, if we're failing to get above 92, which between basically 91.60 and 92, that's kind of the zone to look for the top of our range there. So if we get a rejection back below that area, I'll look for a short. I'll look to my target for that would be the 4-hour 200, and then of course the other way I will look to long after a rejection between the 4-hour 200 and the daily 55. So for pressure into this area, and then a failure to long, or more than likely we'll see two bounces. So basically a move into this area, a move up, a retest, and then something like an engulfing or at least railroad tracks, shooting star pattern, that type of thing on the second bounce. All right, pound odd. We closed a little bit higher last week, depending on what happens with the news situations. This gave us a couple areas to look for a trade. We have this kind of top area that we were trying to get through last week, and you can see that we basically shot up from that area. There's probably a gap there and subsequent move up as the week opened. So we can look for a bounce off of that area. We also have the 4-hour Dynafibs, which have given us pretty good trades. You can see here we did hit the 4-hour 200. So I'm going to be looking for basically a move off of the weekly pivot or around WS1, which the 4-hour Dynafib should move up to slightly. So those are the two areas that I want to look for a reaction to trade to the long side. Now, of course, that's all going to be dependent on what kind of effect the European court ruling has on the pound, and what the fallout from that is. Pound yen, I've got a bit of a different fib here. We were pretty much sideways last week. So we did try to make a move down, and then ended up closing relatively close to our open. So from here I fibbed from actually took it off the low of this candle here, which is basically the major support and resistance area that we broke for basically the continuation of this uptrend line that we have here. So I fibbed from there to the high, and this is actually this trend line is actually drawn from the weekly. I cleaned it up a little bit on the daily, and I want to take a look at it on the weekly so I can show you guys. It's going to look a little funky because I have such a high resolution. So here, if we look at this, I turned candlesticks on. So if we look at the weekly, you can see here that last week we pushed pretty much well below it, but we closed flat, and then we opened, kind of basically sideways to come outside of the trend line. So that gives us basically the crux at 191. So if we put pressure into this area a couple times and then get a solid rejection, preferably a close above the recent high, above like 192.30, we can look for a long from there. However, if we do break below the trend line, we could see a more significant pullback down, perhaps down to the 4-hour 200. That would be my first target for a move down from there. We do have one other zone in here to work with, which makes it a little bit tricky actually. I've drawn these lines here. You can see this is basically between 189 and 189.30. The lines are drawn a little bit roughly. But this area here, you can see where it was a little bit pivotal back in this area. But this is going to be a pretty good area of support and resistance as far as I can tell. So if we do break the trend line, if you do happen to take a short off a bit, which I think is a little bit risky. Of course, my preferred trades are long, and I haven't been counter trend trading for a while. You're definitely going to want to keep this area in mind, the 189, 189.30 area in mind. That's going to be the intermediate area for basically any move headed back down towards the 4-hour 200. And potentially we can see, of course, a bounce off of this area for a move back up, which will be perfectly tradable. You have to deal with the trend line as we come back up towards that. So I think that might have been for pound yen still. I think that might have been a little bit confusing. So let's look at this real quick and recap. So our first area we can look for reaction to trade long is the crux of this trend line in 191. Now this is a weekly trend line. I drew it from the weekly and then cleaned it up a little bit on the daily. But we have, of course, the 189.30 to 189 area that I talked about. So if we do break this trend line, you can look for a long from here. You definitely want to look, of course, for the same entry signals. And basically what we would see from that, if the trade was successful, was that we had another tail on this trend line, essentially, when we look at it from the weekly standpoint. And then, of course, if we would end up with a valid trend line break on the weekly, we would expect that our first area to look for a reaction back to the upside is going to be the 4-hour 200. So basically, you've got three areas to long from. 191 being the most, having the most risk, and then second, 189.30 being, the second most risk, and then here being our strongest area of support. So just to clarify there. Pound USD, we have broken the daily 200, so of course we'll look for a retest there and then an entry to long back above that area if it holds. But we can also take shorts if we do happen to break all the way back down through the EMAs. We could break the daily 55 and then retest and then trade short from there. And of course we'll have to be careful. Hopefully the entry would be below 152.50, and then we'll have to be careful coming up on the recent low around 151.60. Excuse me, I drew that kind of crooked. That low is right at 151.80, 151.60. Okay, so another pair that I haven't looked at in a little while, we're going to take a look at Euro AUD. I used to trade this quite frequently, and then it got a little bit messy and kind of difficult to trade, and there were just better opportunities elsewhere. But for the last few weeks, we've been the daily 200 has been fairly significant in support and resistance, of course, as it usually is. But price has been respecting that quite well, and there definitely have been some decent trades from it. So you can see that we've broken above it for a couple weeks now, and we're starting to meander back down in that direction. We are currently just below the 4-hour 55. So it would be possible to take a trade from up here. This is definitely a support and resistance area, and the 4-hour 55. We took a break back above there. But I'm more interested, especially with the news for this week, to see if our grouping of EMAs down here holds and look for a long from that area. It could provide us with a better midterm trade. All right, Euro Yen. Of course, we have our nice cluster of EMAs in here, which we could expect to take a long from. But I think the stronger area for me is going to be 137. I'll look for that to hold and take a long from there. And if we do happen to come back down into these EMAs, I'm not going to take a long entry from there unless we're closing back above 137. And of course, that would have to line up with the rest of the entry rules that I look at, so that, of course, those may line up correctly on the first move through there. If we do happen to break below the daily 55, it could provide us a good opportunity to change directions and short. All right, let's take a look at AUD JPY. This is another pair that looks like it's stuck in a range, basically 94.50, which we could have the bottom moving up. We're going to trade. I definitely want to be above the 2 daily EMAs on entry. Fine being below the 4-hour 200, because of course the 2 daily EMAs are going to carry more weight, and the top of our range, of course, being basically slightly just below 197. So I'll look for that area to hold if you want to take the short back down from there. On USD, we're starting to get smushed a little bit, but there's still enough room to trade. So I'll look for the daily 55 to hold, and we can take shorts from there. We do have the low here at right around 0.76, so which has been pretty tough to break. So that would be first profit take from any short from the daily 55. And of course, if we do have the daily 55 break, since we're starting to kind of form a downward wedge here, look for a pullback and then a long up to the daily 200, which is going to coincide with 8,000, which is definitely a strong area where I would then look for basically rejection from there. Now, of course, we go racing up here, we get a price rejects there. Probably, depending on, unless the candles are extremely convincing, I'm going to look to take profit as soon as we hit there if we've broken the daily 55 and I've got an entry, but I'm not just going to turn around and sell immediately. I'm going to wait for the retest and then a rejection, and then I'll take the sell. That is, of course, assuming that that scenario plays out. Definitely for right now, I'm going to be looking to short from the daily 55. I'm also going to be definitely have to have a strong entry and rejection pattern there as well. New Zealand dollar versus the US dollar. This was the most muted move as far as the move against the New Zealand dollar from last week. When you look at basically all the pairs that have New Zealand dollar in them. So we probably see, or I would be fine with a bit of a shallower pullback than compared to some of the others. So we have the 4-hour 55 here, which is lining up nicely with our 50% fib, a mid-turn fib. You can see that that's creating a nice super convergence zone. And then entry signal from there would probably put us below .7050. So that gives us a lot of areas basically for our stop movie behind for price to break through. And of course, all those areas of confluence give us a solid reason to look for a short from there. And of course, the fundamentals are going to back that up. And we'll have to see what FOMC says from there. USD CAD, it's really hard to see, but we're basically sitting just above the daily 55 and 4-hour 200. And you can see that during the middle of last week, we made a push into there, and we've kind of just meandered back up and moved sideways a bit. So here it's kind of like a break in either direction situation. If we get a solid move up, definitely clearing back above the bullish Dynafib, we can look for a long from there, at least back up to the recent highs. However, if we get a significant push down, I'll look for, of course, the daily 200 to be hit, and then that is also 120.50, which 120 is going to be a strong support area. So we can look for trades back above that area. US yen technically looks pretty easy. We, of course, smashed through 122 a couple weeks ago now, and on the longer term time frames you can see on 4-hour, and of course above that we didn't really got a pullback to that area yet. So we moved down pretty much last week, and we're moving into striking distance to basically retest 122, and of course we've got the 4-hour 200 and the daily 55 right in that zone. Of course, we'll expect that area to hold and a nice long from there, which should give us a nice, really good RR essentially, because we'll be targeting at least all the way back up to 125.70. All right, last and looks like this week maybe the least, because this one doesn't look too easy to trade, and of course all the news events pretty much this week are going to affect it one way or the other. And you can see on the daily I've got a few trend lines drawn. We've got basically two formations of a triangle. Here we have our quicker trend line, and I don't like this one as much. It looks pretty decent from the daily, but when you look at it on the 4-hour, it's basically this isn't really a touch there, so we've kind of only got two really, in my opinion. I like this trend line a lot better, because you can see here where we clearly tested that trend line the longer term and rejected it on the daily. So let's take a look here on the 4-hour. More aggressively, we could trade a break of the daily 55 and this faster trend line, but we would have pretty tight management because I definitely want my stop to be at break even before we got down to the second trend line. So overall, my bias here is still to short. Of course, depending on what happens with the news later in the week, that could definitely change. But I would like to ultimately take a short below this trend line, or if the news kind of changes the outlook, a solid break and pull back and move up for a long. All right, that's going to be it for me for the beginning of the week. Happy trading, everybody.